So in this particular example, what we're going to cover today is filtering within Spotfire. So typically how filtering works is, as we know, when data is interacted with, I can go in and out of the box, these charts and visualizations will have the same marking scheme. And the same thing applies with filtering. So for example, if I go to the filter for region and unselect the Midwest, you're going to notice that both charts out of the box within Spotfire are going to not have the Midwest section when I uncheck it. The reason for that is when I go into the properties for either of these charts, go to the Data tab, you're going to notice when I go down to the filtering section that as a default, Spotfire checks off the current filtering selected for the page. And it also creates one default filter for the entire group. We can actually edit and create new filters for this entire selection and edit how those are shown. How that happens is I would go into the document properties and I would go to the filtering scheme section. The first thing I'd like to point out is always check this box when you're working with multiple filtering schemes. That way it will actually show that menu when we bring up the filter panel. Notice how it has filtering scheme here. We're going to create a brand new one and just call it filtering scheme 2. So now the purpose here is for this particular filtering scheme, I'm going to switch it to not have the Midwest. Now when I bring up the filter panel, we're going to notice that as a default, remember, whatever filtering scheme is selected for this page is the one that will be applied. So since in this particular filter scheme the Midwest isn't selected, when I switch to the other filtering scheme by clicking on the arrow and selecting the drop down, you're going to notice that the Midwest now exists in this particular example. I could filter out a different one, such as the Northwest. So as I switch in between these two filtering schemes, it's going to have different ones selected. However, if you want to have it so that each individual filter is responded to a different scheme, how that would work is by going into the properties, going to that same data panel, scrolling down, and noticing how instead of using the current filtering, I want to instead use an individual filtering scheme. So notice how for this property we've set it for the first filtering scheme. When we go to the second one, we're going to set it to the second filtering scheme. So when I close out, notice how the Midwest is selected in filtering scheme 2, but the Northwest is still existent in the original filtering scheme. And this doesn't change anything when I change in between these individual filtering schemes. So this teaches you how to have a separate filtering scheme for each one. The only problem with this is, of course, if I want to filter in between these individual charts, I have to switch back and forth. The workaround for this is to create a text area, to edit the text area, and to create insert individual filters. So what I can do here is in between these individual filtering schemes, we'll start with the first one. I'll create a filter for region. Where is it? There it is. And then we're going to enter another filter for the second filtering scheme, which will also be region. I'll put some space in between these filters. And when I exit out and confirm the save, you're going to notice that I now have the ability to mess with both filters on the same page without having to switch to a separate filtering scheme. Some things I'll point out about the filter panel here that I think are pretty important to cover. The first thing I'd like to point out is notice how it has all the different values, and it's very clunky to say. How I could edit this, however, is I could right-click on the filtering scheme and go to Organize the Filters. This allows me to choose which ones are showing, what type of filters they are, and I can even group filters into a certain section. So this allows me to group the filters and hide which ones are available. I can even choose how the filters are named. In this particular data set, I only have one data table. However, I do have the ability to have multiple data tables filters showing. So this allows you to clean up that filter panel. On top of that, I can right-click on a filter, go to the Filter Type button, and see that there's a few different filter options available for me. And there's many different ways to work with filters here. The thing I'll point out is if I go to the region filter for this particular example and switch it from a checkbox to a radio button, notice how it automatically updates in the actual filter panel here. And it's also been updated in this particular filter panel. The reason this is important is because in the Spotfire consumer, you do not have access to the data panel. You only have access to the filter panel or any filters that you've pre-created within the dashboard itself. That is all today for filtering in Spotfire.